Wow, I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled to see everyone. Thank you all for tuning in this evening. Um, Welcome to How to Teach the Korean War. My name is Jason Oliver Chang. I'm Associate Professor of History and Asian American Studies at the University of Connecticut. And I am also the director of the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute, where we house the Curriculum Lab. The Curriculum Lab is a space that we've grown that serves the needs of teachers and students across the state, help build curriculum and offer professional development to meet our state's new mandate to include Asian American Pacific Islander studies in K through 12 public schools in Connecticut. So the Curriculum Lab this year is generously supported by the Asian American Foundation, and we're able to fund this program through that generous grant. So before we get started with today's program, I also want to acknowledge that the land that I'm tuning in from is the land of the Wanggung, Sikyog, and Tungsis peoples, and that it's, even though they are not federally recognized tribes, we honor their struggle and their survival through the centuries and through cycles of conquest. And that is one of the reasons why we want to teach these wars, because they are all interlinked. So our roadmap for this evening is to offer our three distinguished panelists about 15 minutes to really share with us what are the reasons why they approach the Korean War the way they do, how they teach it in their classrooms, and what do they use to teach? What are the resources that they teach? Um, and so with each of them providing a 15-minute snapshot of their approaches, we'll then turn to a cross-panel conversation so that we can see how this interdisciplinary approach to looking at the Korean War is so generative and produces a lot of exciting ways for students to engage with the question. Um, so after that, then we'll turn to a Q&A with the audience, and really want to invite people to ask substantive questions about the histories, about pedagogy, about experiences of teaching the Korean War in the classroom. These are all relevant questions that we want to hear and ponder this evening. So that's my roadmap for this webinar. When we get to the portion where the panelists will be talking with each other, I'll also be sharing a teacher's guide and local Connecticut resource handbook that has some images from our panelists and their lesson plans, as well as I might take a few minutes to spotlight some local resources and how we can connect the study of the Korean War to Connecticut itself, right? So I think these local connections are really important and help to ground the significance of this work. So now I'm gonna stop my introduction, and I really want to sing the praises of these three panelists. So I'm gonna go in alphabetical order, and this is the order they'll present in. And so first is Kimberly McKee, and she's associate professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies at Grand Valley State University. She is the author of Adoption Fantasies: The Fetishization of Asian Adoptees from Girlhood to Womanhood, published by the Ohio State University Press in last year. Congratulations, tremendous. And Disrupting Kinship: Transnational Politics of Korean Adoption in the United States, with University of Illinois Press, 2019. That's also my press for my first book. It's amazing. They were wonderful to work with. And she's also a co-editor of Degrees of Difference: Reflections of Women of Color on Graduate School, also with University of Illinois Press in 2020. And currently, she's a U.S. Fulbright Scholar in South Korea at Sogang University. Welcome, Kim. So glad to have you. Now I want to introduce Professor Na-Rae Kim, and she is, and this may be the first time I'm introducing her in this position, but she is Assistant Professor of English and Asian American Studies at the University of Connecticut. So congratulations. We're so happy to have you in tenure track faculty here at the Institute. And she's also Associate Director of the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute. And her research explores 21st century Korean American literary imaginations of South Korea, North Korea, and Korean America. Welcome, Na-Rae. Great to have you with us. Thank you also for organizing this panel. This would not have happened without your networks, your connections, and your passion for this. So thank you so much. And last but not least, Professor Suzy Kim is a historian of 20th century Korea with a focus on North Korea. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago and teaches at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures. Suzy, it's so great to meet you. Welcome. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and turn the stage over to you, Kim. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be joining you guys from South Korea. And I think how I first want to approach this question in terms of how I teach the Korean War, how I arrived to this question, I actually have to think about my own K through 12 education because I spent much of my high school career teaching myself. This isn't to say that it wasn't embedded in the curriculum, it was, but I was really interested in just learning more about Korea and Korean history as somebody who is a Korean adoptee. And so how I end up engaging the Korean War within my own classroom is really spending time thinking about how did the Korean War affect the everyday lives of Korean people, as well as what are those long-lasting reverberations um, in the lives of Korean families. And so, oftentimes when I teach about the Korean War in the context of my class, Asian American experiences, I first focus on how did the U.S. sort of conceive of the war and see the war in terms of it being, quote, the first hot war of the Cold War and like what that looks like. Um, and then thinking about why is it considered a forgotten war and what does that mean when we start placing into context the experiences of Korean military brides, Korean mixed race children, and then monoracial Korean children. And so for me, I first kind of try to anchor the class into thinking about how do we understand US militarism? How do we understand um, what does it mean when the US continues to occupy South Korea? Um, what does it mean when we think about those genealogies and that history? Because to understand present day US Korean relations, you have to understand the Korean War. To understand the experiences of Korean adoptees in this current moment, you also have to understand the Korean War. And so, given that there's more than 200,000 Korean international adoptees globally, the majority of which did not arrive immediately after the Korean War. In fact, Korean adoption didn't peak until the 1980s. That said, the Korean War is something kind of that draws everybody in. And they're like, oh, well, because of the war, you must have been adopted because of humanitarian rescue, because, you were being rescued from poverty and degradation. And that narrative really has taken hold not just to understand Korean international adoption, but other forms of transnational adoption. And so I use the Korean War as kind of an anchoring point to really think through how do we understand what historian Arissa O has called Christian Americanism, to really think about the role of the church and religious organizations framing adoption as rescue. So here I'm thinking about some of the work of Harry Holt and his wife Bertha Holt and the Holt Adoption Project, now known as Holt International. Um, I also think about the work of other religious aid organizations in framing some of this early discourse. And so, because of that, when I do engage understandings of the Korean War, I also spend time thinking too about questions about race, specifically because some of the earliest adoptees were mixed race. They were half white or half black, as well as Korean, with their fathers being affiliated with US or UN military troops on the peninsula. Um, and so it offers a useful lens for us to think about how did understandings of anti-blackness function in Korea, as well as how did understandings of a Korean like a Korean national identity end up emerging in terms of the outplacement of mixed race children. Additionally, because of thinking about sort of the history of the Korean War on the peninsula, I spent some time thinking too about what does it mean when we shift to the adoption of monoracial children. And so thinking about the Korean War as just as a beginning point and not as a sort of end point, right? So thinking about the Korean War as the beginning of something much larger that I think no one could have anticipated. And by the late 1950s, as Korean adoption started, um, for the most part, when we think about transnational adoption in the context of war, oftentimes those countries end up stopping transnational adoptions. And so here I'm thinking about what happened after the post World War II period for Germany and Japan, for instance. Those countries did not kind of engage in this prolonged, decades long adoption project like South Korea. Additionally, and here I'll wrap up just to allow my panelists some additional time as well. I spend some time thinking too about how can I situate contemporary understandings of adoptee experiences within this historical framework. So I oftentimes use adoptee authored literature that has come out since the 1990s, where adoptees are really reflecting on how the Korean War, as well as other wars in Asia, greatly impacted their experiences with non-Asian Americans in the US. And so here I think about the ways in which adoptees found themselves racialized as both Asian, as Korean, and just as other broadly. And so whether this was facing racist stereotypes, thinking about limited representations in American popular culture as well, um, it offers an opportunity for us to start disentangling these various threads to think too about how US engagement in wars in Asia also help shape those same stereotypes. And I look forward to talk about more concrete examples throughout tonight's programming.
Thanks so
Yeah.
much for that
Thank,
wonderful, sorry, Jason. Yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful beginning. I also wanted to start by thinking a little bit about my own positionality. So I am a South Korean person who was born in South Korea, grew up as a third culture kid in other countries, and then came back to Korea before my educational migration to the United States for my graduate education. So one of the things that I realized early on when I first went abroad is that people are not that interested in Korea or know about Korea, or very simple things that still baffles me, like the difference between South Korea and North Korea, that, people joke about, like, where are you from? Oh, are you from North Korea? And a lot of my South Korean friends like laugh, oh, how could they not know? Or how are they joking? But I think it actually hides a bigger truth. Like, why is it funny that you don't know about it? And why is it funny that if you are assumed to be from North Korea, that is either an affront or a sign of your own ignorance, right? Like there's a lot of different assumptions that accompany what a South Korean means versus who a North Korean means, right? So for me, there was this reckoning of the fact that what I, as a person who is from South Korea, grew up just gathering, not only through K-12 education, but just gathering and living my everyday reality that has just somehow just has been built in me is not the truth or expected of people in the United States, even people who are enrolled in my class that is specifically looking at, say, the Korean War or South Korea or a related topic, and that I need to really think about what it means to teach Korea as a Korean person to the largely American audience, who have very different expectations, very different backgrounds. So for me, it really has been a question of what it means to really kind of even spark an interest in why you should be interested in the Korean War. And another question that also ensued from that is how is it that that sort of obscurity of the Korean War, or forgotten war, as people tend to call it, leads to this kind of a chasm between how people understand South Korea as almost a cultural superpower lately, and people do not necessarily understand what it means that South Korea is what it is today and North Korea is what it is today, and how that actually goes all the way back to the Korean War and its current day reverberations, right? So for me, thinking about the Korean War and teaching the Korean War has been this journey to tell people what it means to think about the modern history of Korea and Korean Peninsula, and why the Korean War didn't necessarily end in 1953 is what a common kind of knowledge or a lot of lessons in the United States kind of designated as a war that started in 1950 that ended with a ceasefire in 1953, and Korean War, or Korea is oftentimes called it like post-war South Korea of X, Y, and Z. And I have actually really intentionally tried to move away from using that language in my handout, because the war is not over, if I may actually say that. The peace treaty was never signed, but there's a lot of contentions about what started the war, what ended the war. Is it a civil war, international war, like Cold War? Like there's a lot of different contentions, right? So one of my goals in whenever I teach about the Korean War is to really show the long durée of the Korean War, to really start with the colonial era, if not before, and actually going all the way to the present to think about some of the reactions or actions that has been committed by Koreans and other nation states are largely resulting from or are ripple effects from the Korean War, and how that then allows us to think about the militarized peace, right? The South Korea's quote unquote economic success or its stability is actually coming from hefty military and civilian lives and sacrifices, and that is something that people want to willingly forget, which is why I argue that actually it is forgotten with a very huge intentions on many people's part. So those are some of the larger questions that I have. In terms of how I approach this question of the long durée of the Korean War, the militarized peace and what that means, and why Korea is a country that is still under war, but that is not recognized as war, allows us to further think about war in a different way, so that war is not something that is just clearly over when, say, even if the peace treaty is signed, but what are its reverberations and what are its afterlives, right? And how that continues to affect people. And how that allows us to then think about what it means to actually think about how war and peace are conjoined especially in the modern days, and how that actually rationalizes and justifies a lot of different types of violence in our time, making the relevance of the Korean War beyond not just the Korean Peninsula or Korea versus US, but other wars that continues to go on, sadly, in our time. But when I think about that, one of the things that I really try to think about is through representation. So I'm a literary scholar with a PhD in English, and it is unavoidable to teach a topic like the Korean War without teaching history. But again, I'm not a historian, but I think a lot about what it means to teach history and how do you teach history? How do you do history? As a literary scholar, it's so often that a lot of literary texts, like short stories, fictions, films, are utilized as valuable tools for historical teaching. So I really tried sometimes to do that, like doing very, quintessential historical approach to the Korean War, analyzing speeches, doing the timeline of how like the tank bombarded and how many missiles, what are the type of weapons, X, Y, and Z. But I actually really deliberately moved away from that lately. I actually try to think about different kinds of representations that came from South Korea, from North Korea in the United States and other parts of the world, and how they collectively paint a very different imagination of the Korean War and its reverberation, and how that actually collectively make us think about different positionalities that people have, different stakes and interests, and different national or cultural assumptions that people bring to that kind of representation, and how even people say same South Korean writers from the same era can actually have very different approach to their representation depending on where they're coming from and what their goal is. And also how that can actually create very, say, a jarring short story versus a short story that reads very that is very entertaining. So I think about these kind of different approaches to representation because I think the Korean War is a prime example of representation in the way in which that is forgotten, in the way in which a lot of historical facts are contended, the way in which it lives on in our time and continues to impact us. So at the core of my course is this notion of representation. And in order for me to ask that, I intentionally bring a lot of different genres. So again, as a literary scholar, I primarily work with novels and short stories and poems, but I also teach films, I also teach installations, art, I teach oral history, and the way in which I approach that kind of different modalities of thinking about the Korean War is to kind of introduce how different modality impacts us differently and how that may actually engender different ways for us to think about something like the Korean War, which is really difficult to grasp, and the part of the difficulty of grasping the Korean War has to do with the fact that it is not over and that it continues to impact us and that it continues to unfold in different ways. So I deliberately engage different medium and different kinds of text so that we can collectively think about then what is the ethics of thinking about this question? What is the ethics of representing or thinking through or voicing this issue? In my handout, I brought two very different kinds of types of materials to think about the Korean War. One last thing that I wanted to just very briefly talk about is whenever I think about the Korean War, and I guess this has to do with that kind of notion of longer framework of thinking about the Korean War, I always think about the Korean diasporas, as Kim, you started to talk about a little bit, Korean adoptees definitely, but there's a lot of different kinds of Koreans, like Koreans who went to South America, multiracial Koreans, military brides, former comfort women who have become military brides, and also like other people who are not necessarily easily linked to the Korean War, say like the international students, people who go for educational study abroad because of the way in which South Korea and the United States are continually colluding for particular political agenda, and that engenders particular desire for English command by Koreans, generating particular types of educational migration. So I think about these figures of Koreans who are not oftentimes associated with the Korean War to really question why, again, we may never arrive at an answer of what is the perimeter of the Korean War, but again, the larger question of what is this place that we live in, what is the way in which we think about the people in the way in which we do, and how is that actually a result of probably our efforts to minimize the impact of the Korean War, and how should we actually question that? So I've kind of jumbled a lot of different things in there, but I'm looking forward to more conversations.
Thank you so much, Na-Rae. That was brilliant. Suzy, the floor is yours.
I realized I needed to get ready. Wow, like really impressed with how both of my co-panelists were able to like keep right on time. I a lot of food for. I was still like eagerly writing notes because I found everything that both Kim and Na-Rae shared was so productive for thinking through. I mean, I feel, I guess I'm the historian in the group. But I must say, I think there's much more overlap as opposed to differences in the way that, within each of our disciplines, we approach thinking through something as complex as the Korean War, because I mean, I think there's a tendency for folks, particularly perhaps at the kind of K through 12 level, to think about presenting something as complex as the Korean War through, documents and, diplomatic records, archival materials, as if that is transparent, and that the kind of the language is, the fact speaks for themselves. But all historians will basically say that facts never actually speak for themselves. It requires interpretation just as much as any other texts, whether that's literary texts or oral histories or, novels, or whatnot. So I guess the way that I approach this topic is, there's been a lot of historiography on the Korean War since the 80s and on, in the so-called category of revisionist histories that really problematize Cold War narratives that paint a rather simplistic picture about, the start of the Korean War as happening on this particular date with the invasion by North Korea of South Korea, and then ending with the armistice. But there's been a lot of historiography that challenges that I think both Kim and Na-Rae have spoken to, about just how complex that is. And I appreciated in particular the way all of the different actors and experiences that we really should be looking at that were impacted by the war, and also thinking about the timeline of the war as being kind of a longue durée, as Na-Rae just spoke about. But unfortunately, I get, when I've done so I have a long-term kind of project where I've been trying to look at how the Korean War has been taught at the K through 12 level, and especially at the secondary level in high schools. And I generally try to do kind of a quick survey when I broach this topic in my undergraduate classes, asking students essentially, oh, like, how many of you have actually learned about the Korean War? And I have to say, I've been surprised by just how many students actually say that they didn't learn very much at all. Uh, Many of them seem to kind of end with World War II, which I found shocking. And so, and even for those that have learned about it, and then some of the textbooks that I've seen, none of it, at least in my opinion, none of the complex historiographies in the last 30 years or so have really trickled down to the K through 12 level, which I think is really unfortunate. And so in the way that I approach the teaching of the war, I'm essentially having to problematize some of the conventional notions that students are already bringing to the table, to the extent they even have any prior knowledge about it. And so, what are the origins and causes of the Korean War? I try to look at that actually by referencing the main participants of the war, that is the two Koreas, the United States and China, in looking at how they even reference the war. How do they call the war? It's the names that that each of these parties give to the war themselves are already different, which is quite telling. It actually, by looking at the names of each of the way that the war is referenced in each of these countries, you can already think about complicating the origins, because the origins of the war from the North Korean and Chinese perspective in particular are much more, not only does it kind of counter the conventional narratives in South Korea or the United States, but they tend to trace the war to much earlier points. So, for example, with the division of Korea in 1945 and the occupation of South Korea by the United States. And then I think, with the current standoff between the two Koreas, and then also between the United States and China of late. I think the students are much more aware that the war in some ways has not ended, despite the fact that the armistice halted the fighting. And so, there's a way in which, even though the war is situated, I mean, the kind of the official narrative of the war is situated in the early 1950s, there's a way that it really can be not only trace kind of the second half of the 20th century broadly, but it really brings the issues to the contemporary moment that I think is very productive for students to think about, like being attuned to current events and being able to tie some of that into learning about this history. So that, in many ways, history, as much as it is about the past, it is also about the present, is something that I think a point that I like to impress upon the students. Um, what else can I say? Oh, and the other part is that, I think both Kim and Na-Rae have spoken to this already, but the way that in the conventional histories, the Korean War is often portrayed in these textbooks, particularly geared towards the K through 12 level, is that it's a very kind of it's a military history approach, a diplomatic history approach, without necessarily including a lot of the voices of the people, the ordinary people that were directly impacted. And insofar, I do think that there has been some effort made in the last, I don't know, I can't really put a specific time to it, but I feel like there's been more concerted efforts through programs exactly like this one to include kind of those ordinary voices, whether through documentaries of, of oral histories taken of the Korean diaspora, or of including, novels and short stories that address the topic in some way, which is certainly more accessible, I think, for students at the K through 12 level than a straightforward diplomatic or military history of the war. But so, I think in addition to complementing some of these alternative sources to look at the war, what I've taken inspiration from is this kind of turn towards experiential learning that I think in a lot of K through 12 lessons teachers are adopting now. And I was trying to think about, how can we actually, without the capacity to actually go on a physical study tour to the Koreas, what are some alternative ways we might be able to do that in the classroom setting? And I realized that all of the main participating countries, and potentially even more beyond that, of the participating countries that were fighting under the umbrella of the United Nations, might also have this. But most places, I think, have either national museums or memorials, or even local memorials dedicated to the Korean War. And I thought it was a good way to think about how to actually bring the North Korean and Chinese perspectives to bear on the discussion, because I think one of the major points that are lacking, especially with the education in the United States, is that it's an overwhelmingly US-centric perspective where, even when everyday individual experiences are included, it tends to be from the veterans. And not to discount obviously the importance of the veteran experience, but I think if you're just focusing on the US experience, then you're really losing out on understanding what is the significance of this war and the history of this war for North Korea, for example, or for the Chinese also. And if you actually look at the estimated number of deaths, for the North Korean casualty estimates, it's anywhere from 1 million to 2 million, which is like, possibly more than 50% of the overall estimates. And then for the Chinese, it's anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million. And if you compare that to the official, I think, death toll in the United States, which is, I think, just over 33,000 of the U.S. soldiers, the service folks who served in Korea. The numbers are, the disparity in the numbers are just quite large. And you can probably say that almost every family in North Korea was impacted by the war. And so it's not all that surprising that kind of this readiness towards a potential another outbreak of war in the Korean Peninsula is a predominant kind of preoccupation for North Korea today. And of course, there's a lot of criticism to be made about the fact that there's an overwhelming amount of resources spent on, weapons development and military readiness within North Korea, while, there are major issues of, food security and all of that. But I think if you look at the history of North Korea being impacted by the war, and being threatened by essentially the United States as a result of the unendedness of the war, then it's not too difficult to imagine why there's been this kind of emphasis placed on security within North Korea. And of course, South Korea does the same, but it has a lot more resources, to spread around beyond just the military. So, and it bears reminding, I think, the fact that the U.S. is a major ally of South Korea, and it is the strongest, military in the world today. So, against that as an opponent for North Korea, it's a kind of a difficult situation. So, and I guess as a historian that has focused on the history of North Korea, I feel a certain sense of responsibility to bring that perspective into the discussion, as opposed to just limiting it to the conventional focus on the United States or South Korea, for that matter. So, and then I was just, in preparing the guide as part of this program that I think Jason will be introducing shortly, and we can talk more about that as we go through the guide. But I was really surprised at how many, websites, even for North Korea, is actually available because of some of these tour groups that operate tours into North Korea. So then they have these, really wonderfully rich photographs and images taken from the museums themselves that can easily be adapted for use, I think, within the classroom and compared to some of these other ones. The U.S. National Park Service operates, is in charge of the veterans, the Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., and their website also has a wealth of information, including actually all of the history of renovations. I mean, the recent additions to the memorial in Washington, D.C. actually is as recent as 2023. I think it was in commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the armistice. And they added a whole new kind of a wall of remembrance. And there's a whole discussion about some of the controversies and debates that happened as a result that can be really productively brought into the planning of the lesson. So anyway, the guide has all of the website links that can be used in the classroom to look at these memorials and compare the narratives about the war productively. And I think it actually speaks really well to how historians go about making interpretations out of, documents that are never actually, it's never as stable as it would seem. Maybe I'll end it there.
This is so rich. Wow, Suzy, thank you. I want to turn to the teaching guide because there's so much background that y'all have provided, but I wanted to save space for y'all to maybe ask each other questions or to build on the conversation that we've started. Before I do that,
I just wanted to say how much I was struck, Na-Rae, about your reflection about growing up in Korea and then, moving around and then finally coming to the United States and thinking about understandings of the Korean War. So, as Jason mentioned in my introduction, I'm currently living in South Korea. I've taken my son to the Children's Museum at the Korean War Memorial. And I was struck there in terms of how the war was being taught, how Japanese colonization was being taught as well in the context of, preceding the war and what that looked like. Um, and it was done in a way where I think it makes the war accessible to young people, um, as well as it doesn't necessarily shy away from really casting and shedding a light in terms of the destruction of what was done to Korean people on the Korean Peninsula in a way that I don't necessarily think we see in children's elementary school education necessarily in the same kinds of ways in the United States, right? So you're at a child's height, you're able to look, you're able to look with like binoculars to kind of see some of these images to really put you there and to ground you there. And I think that really reflects in terms of how this history is very much part of the contemporary period. I know as an adopted person in Reunion, um, really recognizing that I have aunts who were born in the beginning of the war and then toward the end of, in 1953 and what that looks like, and then that and that immediately in the period that immediately follows, right? So thinking about how it's not that long ago. And so, what does that mean then for members of the Korean diaspora as we're talking about the war and teaching the war outside of South Korea as well, too? Because depending on who's in your classroom, that war could feel very immediate to their family when you think about how Korean Americans immigrated to the United States, right? So thinking about those push-pull factors, what happens when you're coming post 1965? What happens when you have um, Korean military brides in your family or adopted people? Thinking too about how adoptees are also grandparents, right? So they're not perpetual children; they're grandparents. Um, and how are we suturing together those histories as well?
Yeah, I think you said it so beautifully. I just want to add one question, I guess, which is, I guess, my response to many of the rich things that you just brought up, Kim. I think what is interesting to me as a person who grew up in South Korea, is that the war and its reality is very much there, and it's also for that reason very absent. There's ways in which that things just get, saturated, and then you just, okay, like there was X amount of death, and we are gonna write this like anti-communist posters in my elementary school art class, but it all loses its validity, it all loses its meaning, it just becomes an act. And I guess that's part of what is, like just part of your everyday life, that it's something that gets banal, right? But at the same time, I do agree the fact that you are reminded of war in very many different levels that is catered to very many different age groups, in very many different settings, does make you aware of the concept, the war. What does it really mean? And as you bring up, like your family, your extended family, how that actually impacts some of the decisions to immigrate, emigrate, within your family, with your friends, like, and how does that actually change some of the things that you think about in ways that you are not actually conscious of at that moment? I think it's very important, and I think is that is one of the reasons that it is actually really hard to teach war in the United States, because it's a country that has the uncomparable military power and has been involved in so many different wars, but it is never at home. For the students, I think what is really difficult to teach about any war is that it just seems so distant to them, that, okay, we had that war, but it's past. Like, what does it mean for us? Okay, we learned and we moved on and we're better now. Like, so that kind of like very, um, liberal approach to war in the US is really hard to crack, whichever war you are dealing with. So I think that's just something that I'm thinking about a lot. And I think that's one of the reasons that even though I primarily identify as a Korean American literary scholar, I specifically wanted to choose a Korean text to really think about what does it mean that I mean, I'm not necessarily privileging particular ethnic voice, but I wanted that if it is one book that you would choose, probably that is a good suggestion. And I guess that kind of brings me to my question to other panelists. I mean, given that we have to deal with the translation and resources, what are some of the sources that you teach in terms of the materials that are originally in English versus materials that are translated? And I'm asking that question partly because of my own questioning. There has been kind of a boom of Korean American literary engagement of the Korean War in the recent years. Like within the past 5 years, I can just like name like 10 off the top of my head. There always was a lot of focus, but like there has been a resurgence that sort of accompanied that kind of like the growth of K-pop, which I think is really interesting phenomenon. And they're excellent. They really bring a lot to the table, and they really bring new perspectives and approaches to the Korean War in ways that it didn't before. And I'm really grateful for them. But I'm always debating like the representation, like how many original English materials do I want to teach to my students? How many translated materials do I want to teach to my students, especially as a literary scholar when the translation always risks particular losing of the texture of the language. So I'm just curious, what are your approaches to the materials and how you actually divide them up and all that?
I don't know. I do think that there's a way that our institutional homes sometimes does like shape a little bit in terms of how our teaching and approach to the topic kind of fits within that departmental curriculum. So, given that I'm in an Asian languages and cultures department, and I am one of the handful of faculty who is part of the Korean program, there is a way in which I'm really, there's really interesting synergies with many of my students who are actually taking Korean language classes. So in the last, I think, couple of years actually, so Rutgers, it turns out, is one of the few schools in the Big Ten, which it is a member of, that doesn't actually have a foreign language requirement. And I think a lot of universities actually tend to have that. For language departments, there's been a big push to try to get the university to have that requirement because it encourages students to take foreign languages. And of course, as you all know, like a lot of departments are lately in the humanities are struggling with enrollment. So this was a way to make sure that, there would be a healthier enrollment in the language classes. But regardless of that, actually, compared to any foreign language, I think there was a study done, or there was an article, released in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, I think, about the fact that all foreign language enrollments have gone down except for Korean. And it's a boon. It's a boom from basically, the Korean K-pop and all of the stuff. So, and I've seen it reflected in my Korean studies classes too, where like, I don't know, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it used to be that most of my classes actually were like, most of the students were Korean heritage students that were taking these courses, but that is no longer at all the case. It's completely a diverse group of folks. And I mean, it's wonderful, and they're all learning Korean language. So, what Rutgers did in the last couple of years is to like they rolled out this whole thing from the humanities division called the Year of Languages. And so, to the extent that even if you're not teaching a language class, if you're able to incorporate language lessons in some kind of way, even if it's kind of small ways, that we were encouraged to do this. And I realized that it was really productive to do that. So, I mean, I already mentioned kind of the different names attached to the Korean War in these different countries. But even in other ways, I mean, I don't know, I just at the top of my head, just because I just did this lesson yesterday, but like, you know, there are multiple ways to refer to families in Korean language, right? I think the formal way in which it's taught within the classroom is like 가족, which is it's a modern neologism that wasn't actually used, I would say, like before the modern era, however fuzzy that definition might be. And the older kind of vernacular way of referring to families is 식구, which isn't really taught in the language classes now. But what's interesting about that is that, you know, 식구, the two Sino-Korean script is meaning um, uh, eating together, or it's like, you know, to eat with your mouth. And so it means a collective that eats together, which I think is really fascinating if you juxtapose it against, you know, this more kind of like biologically derived, you know, bloodline derived conceptions of the family, which is what 가족 really is. And so, you know, as a way to talk about kind of, you know, in the way that both of you, I think, were talking about the diaspora as being much more kind of a richer community than what we might conventionally think about, you know, some of these terminologies I feel like can be used really productively. And so I tried to incorporate that. And I think, you know, I mean, I'm sorry if I kind of like went off track a little bit from the original question about how do you deal with this, but um, even when there are works of translation, I think it's really important to hear, like, have these multiple kind of multiple genres of texts, as well as multiple perspectives that are brought to bear depending on, you know, where those texts are produced. And so in the study guide, I made sure to include like a poem that was originally obviously written in, that was published in North Korea, but but I think we can still learn a lot from that, even if the translation's a bit sloppy.
Kim, would you like to respond to that before I share the study guide?
So I think when I end up teaching the Korean War and kind of its reverberations, I often stick to English language texts in part because I'm not fluent in Korean, right? But when I do integrate Korean source material, most often it tends to be through the voices of birth mothers. And so I think a lot about how their words are being translated by specific documentaries, for instance, or in various clips posted on YouTube by Korean adoptee activists. So, really thinking about who is doing that translating and talking with my students about what is lost in translation. So, oftentimes you'll hear Korean adoptees discuss the ways in which direct translation may not be happening with their documents, especially if they are seeking their birth families or are in reunion and considering, you know, how language is mediated. And I actually believe that this is a fruitful opportunity to get folks to really think about how words matter, how context matters, and then what gets lost when things may get mistranslated, or you know, what happens when you run it through like Papago or Google Translate, and you know is using kind of this outdated word that no one would actually use. So it's a very clear tell that you're not a native language speaker. And I think it provides an opportunity then, especially in the context of broader conversations about the humanities and language, about what AI doesn't necessarily do, right, in terms of understanding those nuances. And so I think for me, at least, having these conversations ends up not only allowing us to talk directly about the subject matter in which we're interested in, but also kind of how it's related to so many other pieces of what's happening in the world globally.
I really want to take y'all's classes. This is just tremendous. You know, if I could just offer a couple thoughts too, you know, I was really struck by what you were saying, Suzy, about your experiences of looking at textbooks and the representations, and you know, one of the things that that I've been really motivated by is the notion that um, that folks can include Asian American studies in K through 12 without talking about war, right? And I think this is a really critical point that that you all are demonstrating, especially you know Kim, the way that you're talking about the you know by really attending to the epistemological question: whose knowledge are we privileging? And and I think that is, you know, again, it just you know reaffirms the importance of you know exploring these questions, doing so in ways that build on multiple perspectives, that bring in multiple linguistic you know kinds of sources, and that really shift you know continuously kind of shifting the perspective, and to get that three-dimensional understanding of you know historical development. So I'm so appreciative because this is so rich and so needed. Um, and so I thought what I'd like to do is share my screen so we can observe what this teaching guide looks like. And as we're going through it, I'd like for each of you to discuss the sources that you have, and perhaps you know, spotlight a question or an approach, an analytical approach related to that source, so that we can kind of get a flavor for what's in here and um, how we can take what we've learned in this panel and apply it to you know thinking about lesson design and putting these resources in conversation with one another. And then I'll kind of wrap up at the end by sharing some of the local connections that we have that I think just so excited about these the thematic overlaps, the historical connections, and the interdisciplinary kinds of thinking. And as you're saying, these are the Korean War is a really rich subject, which all of these so many different skills can be learned by exploring this. So so let me share this and let's see here. Right, is that coming through okay? Yep. Okay, great. Okay, so I took from the flyer for the webinar and turned that into our cover sheet here, highlighting our distinguished panelists. And then this is our table of contents here. And so, uh, Kim, your lesson is first, then followed by Na-Rae's, Suzy's, and then a bunch of resources that I've collected for folks to think about. Um, so, Kim, let's start with you. Uh, what is it that you've included here in this first lesson?
So in the first lesson, I provide a brief overview of transnational adoption from Korea. I highlight two key figures in transnational adoptions from Korea, both Pearl Buck and Harry Holt. Both were um, kind of notable figures in terms of their unorthodox methods for child placement. Neither one were trained social welfare professionals, and yet both have become kind of faces of Korean transnational adoption for a variety of reasons. Um, and in the case of Holt, which it is included, I believe, I have a footnote of Universal Newsreels where you can see Holt kind of in his gregarious persona being featured. So that's a really great primary source text to share with students so they really understand how Holt was positioned as kind of this grandfather or godfather of Korean adoption, bringing these war waifs over to the United States. At the same time, I wanted to shine a light on the adult Korean adoptee community because, as I was saying earlier this evening, oftentimes adoptees are still seen as children, still seen as tied to a immediate part of the Korean War's aftermath, right? So thinking about the 1950s and 1960s, with little regard to really understanding that adoptees were coming together and forming community as early as the late 1980s, and then with widespread formation of adult Korean adoptee organizations at the turn of the 21st century. The two texts that I provide examples for, one is called Monstrous. It's a transracial adoption story. It's an illustrated graphic memoir by Sarah Myer. And Myer is actually reflecting on her experiences growing up in the United States in the 1990s. And so initially you might be like, well, how does this have to do with the Korean War? And for me, what I like about this text is it's very accessible to young adults as well as an adult audience, to be honest, right? But what she does is really ground you in thinking about, well, what was it like growing up in the 1990s in the United States, where you were seeing the ways in which the erasure of understanding of where Korea is, let alone the Korean War, to really think about the importance of context, to think about what does it mean when your adoptive parents don't really understand either. I should note, and I note in the guide, that um, teachers should speak with students about the language used in the text because Sarah Myer, the author, to adequately capture kind of her own experiences, you know, she depicts the racist, ableist, and homophobic language used at the time in the 1990s. I will admit, when I first read it, I was like, oh gosh, but it really actually reminds you of what it was like at that time. And I think for our students, it's would be very eye-opening to see how liberally people used such terminology, um, 20, 30 years ago, to have that conversation and what that means. Additionally, the other text that I reference is the documentary film In the Matter of Cha Jung-hee by Deann Borshay Liem. Uh, Deann has done so many wonderful documentaries, both related to the Korean War as well as to adoption. I selected In the Matter of Cha Jung-hee because what Borshay Liem does in this film is think about how the Korean War orphan story carried on from the 1950s into the 1960s. And she reflects on how, prior to really thinking sort of more critically about this question, she kind of believed in her own paperwork the story that her father died in wartime, and sort of thinking about what that looks like, even though she wasn't adopted till the mid 1960s, right? So it allows us a lens to think about how did such a narrative was able to persist. It also provides an opportunity to think about how um, and I know, Na-Rae, you don't like the phrase post-war, and now I'm thinking about like how I even talk about the Korean War, but how following the Korean War, sponsorship plans were used. And so you had things like the foster parents plan. You had smaller aid organizations offering sponsorship opportunities. So for like $2 a month, you could sponsor Korean War orphan, right? And really think about what does it mean then when with families who are sponsoring those children decide, oh, I want to adopt that child, and what that looks like, because that was the case for the original girl named Cha Jung-hee. And I say the original girl because for Shay Lim, what she uncovers, and what's demonstrated in her first documentary, first person plural, but what she goes more into depth with in this documentary, In the Matter of Cha Jung-hee, she talks about how she was set in place for this child. She also unearths that there was a third girl who was also sort of the stand-in for the original Cha Jung-hee. And so the documentary follows her as she's trying to figure out who was this girl? Who was this girl that she literally wore the shoes of coming to the United States, taking on that identity until she was able to uncover her own biological origins and meet her original family. And so, what I hope that this particular text does is also shine a light on the complexities of transnational adoption. She also highlights, too, as one final thing, the arbitrariness of transnational adoption. So, we see her in navigating life, or not life necessarily, navigating, walking around Seoul, meeting other transnational adoptees from European countries. So, thinking about how she could have ended up in one of those countries. Adoption is so happenstance. There's not a lot of things that the adoptee themselves as infants or toddlers could control. And it was It was very arbitrary. And so I think what the film really demonstrates is how war doesn't kind of have a predetermined ending either, right? Adoptees could have been sent all over the place. It was just by the stroke of luck or the stroke of a pen that they ended up in the families that they did. And so my hope is with both texts is that you're able to provide both a contemporary and historical understanding to the Korean adoptee diaspora.
This is tremendous. Yeah, I really appreciate the diverse selection of sources here and the references, the discussion questions, and the links. These are really wonderful. Thank you, Kim. Can we turn now right to your lesson here?
Yeah, thank you. I'm trying to absorb, Kim, what you brought up. So the two texts that I chose is, first of all, a short story called Chinatown, by Jung-hee, and in Korean it is called 중국인 거리. And it is, it's actually a very bleak and difficult story to teach. So it is a short story about an unnamed female child protagonist in first-person narrative, sharing her formative years of life in the Chinese street. Actually, I put a note on the title. The literal translation is the Chinese street, not Chinatown, because there is that particular connotation of Chinatown in the U.S., which is different in Korea, and there is a Chinatown in Korea, which the story is kind of adjacent to, but it is not exactly there. So I just wanted to put like some keynotes and key information so that this quite difficult story is a little more digestible and accessible when you are approaching it. But I chose this particular story, as I said before, because I wanted to really highlight what the post-war South Korea is like, especially for children, and what adults their lives were seen through the eyes of a child narrator. And when we say a child narrator, automatically we have certain kind of assumptions of childlike innocence, child sincerity, hopeful eyes, and all of those are disavowed in this text, which is why it is very difficult. The narrator or the protagonist is 9 to 10 years old in the span of the story. But there are really difficult lines, like quotes such as, quote, "So does your mom spank you and tell you to get lost and drop dead?" I asked. "Yeah, when no one's around." Seok lowered her pants and showed me her bruised thighs. "I'm going to run away and be a GI's whore." So that's like one of those quotes that really show that in this story, this narrator, who is a child and who actually largely befriends other childs and spends a lot of time hanging out with other children, are not what we would imagine an innocent child having fun, joyous, having hopes. However, I wanted to choose the story to really show how civilians' lives were affected right in the post-war years. The story is set in the 1950s, late 1950s, so a few years after the armistice. And it really charts that devastation and abject poverty of the Korean War. But however, there is that kind of glimmer of hope in that dire situation, how children, because they are children, even as the child protagonist is initiated into adulthood and comes to what seems like accept what she calls a brutish life of a woman. But there are these instances where the children can actually exert change and they can see hope or desire things that adults cannot. So there is that kind of really disparity between how the children are depicted in this short story versus how the adults are. So I wanted to introduce this story to kind of really think about not only what the immediate aftermath of South Korea was like for everyday people who were literally runaway people or displaced people within their own land, but also to think about what would the future be when such a child and who was like 10 at like 4 years after the Korean War grows up to be an adult in 70s and 80s through Korea's tumultuous democratization and industrialization process. What kind of ideologies would they bring? What kind of hopes would they bring to social change? What kind of desires would they have for social mobilities and international immigration, if you will, right? So those were kind of the larger questions that I had at the back of my hand, and I put some of those gestured to them in the discussion questions. But for the purpose of the handout, because again, it is a very bleak story that many students may actually find difficult to read or to relate to. I wanted to include a lot of information that could be helpful for the teachers to actually kind of break it down for the students. And I do put a note in the discussion questions that probably it would be important for the students to think about, like, how does this particular depiction of the post-armistice Korea make you think about, say, South Korea, when South Korea is seen as this glimmering, like, modern city, modern country, exporting goods and cell phones and songs and films. Like, how does that, like, what happened in the middle, and what are we actually forgetting or not really taking in? And what would be like, what would it have been like for North Korea when, as Suzy mentioned before, North Korea fared much better. Destruction was much more severe in North, literally. The demolishment of the cities and the livelihood of people were much, much more severe. And how would the North Koreans have fared when it was like this in South Korea? So I wanted this kind of as a conversation piece for people to begin to think about, what does a war-torn nation look like, and how can you actually start to build from the rubbles of war when there's nothing to actually build with? So it is a very difficult story to read, but I was hoping that this handout would be helpful to kind of break it down. And what I really did not want is for the students to really think, oh, okay, like, we're so lucky. We didn't have any of this. We had milk to drink, like, we had food to drink. We didn't dream of being a GI's war, or run away and drop dead. Like, so I really was hoping that kind of conversation would not take place. So I put in some of the questions and writing prompts that would allow the students to kind of plug themselves into the context of war, whether it is the Korean War or other kinds of war, so that they can begin to think about what it means to actually take responsibility for what is happening. And for that reason, there's a little terms that I have introduced, which specifically highlight some of the GI and Chinese influences in South Korea, including Yanggongju, or General Douglas MacArthur's statue, or the Mutual Defense Treaty and GI camp towns, which are all at the backdrop of the story, looking kind of showing us the way in which America's militarism has saturated the everyday life for people, and how children as young as 9 or 10 years old know the insurmountable power difference between a GI versus their own lives. The next piece, real quick, is an installation piece by Haegue, and it is it has a very long title. I can't remember it off the top of my head, Jason. It is Migratory DMZ Birds on Asymmetric Lens, Kyott Vessel, Pale Thrush. So this is a part of an art exhibition that was called DMZ Art and Peace Platform 2021. And I explain a little bit of what it is. And the reason that I wanted to choose this piece is I wanted to introduce this very exhibition, which was largely an aspirational project. A lot of Korean artists and 4 foreign artists were commissioned, or were actually utilizing previous works to contribute to this DMZ Art and Peace platform. So it was an exhibition with this kind of larger rubric. How can we think about DMZ, the demilitarized zone, not as a buffer zone for military fighting or very highly armed place, but as a place that we can think about peace and unification or solidarity, different ways to think about future when political conversations are not necessarily going to places that people would like, or when the truth doesn't look like there are those glimmers of future or hope. So I wanted to introduce this piece, which was actually literally placed in the DMZ, and that is a deceptively simple piece. I think it is an accessible piece for high school or middle school students as well. I've put a link to what it looks like, and the YouTube link that I put in shows kind of the multiple directional, like the whole 360 angle of the piece, so that you can kind of take a look at what it looks like in whole. But it is actually deceptively simple, meaning that it can actually generate very simple understandings of like these different perspectives of peace, discontinuities and continuities, but there are a lot of difficult matters to think through. So I thought it would be an easy piece for many levels of students to think through, but I wanted to introduce a piece that was very recently conceived in order to kind of break the difficulty of having fruitful political conversations. And I wanted to kind of show how many people who are thinking about the Korean War are thinking about different ways to intervene to the present for a different future and radical transformations, and how sometimes that takes different measure, not always just big boys meetings and conversations, but by art, by creating. And I wanted the students to kind of think about what can they do? How can they actually think about the present and the future? And how does a change come to be made? So I wanted to end with this kind of more futuristic piece.
There are supposed to be some images in here that you've shared, Na-Rae, and for some reason I have left them out. I will fix that when I send this out.
Yeah, I was thinking I'm not so
Thank you.
sure of the copyright issues, so probably links are better.
Okay, yep, will do. Our third lesson is yours, Suzy. And you know, it's no surprise that we've gone over time and we're eating into the Q&A portion. So I'm going to go very quickly through mine and hopefully get to at least one question. But I do want to spotlight your lesson here, Suzy. So go ahead.
Well, I think I was actually being mindful of the time as well. And I think, you know, earlier in my first kind of 15-minute intro, I actually did kind of discuss most of this. So I don't think we need to like dwell too much on it. I basically broke up, it's a virtual tour of each of the four sites, the one in Pyongyang, the War Museum in Pyongyang, and then the Seoul War Memorial, and then the United States, the Washington Memorial. I will just say very quickly that the part of the motivation for me in looking at these memorials and monuments was that, or museums, was that in 2015, I think it was, I guest edited a thematic journal issue that gathered essays from different scholars based in different disciplines and actually positioned in different areas. There was a historian from Canada, there was a sociologist from South Korea, and then a few other folks, a literary scholar in the United States, and then myself and another sociologist in South Korea who worked on different parts of these different museums and memorials. And so, and that is all available open access with images that instructors can easily take, you know, basically take out from those articles. You know, you're free to use the articles, I think, for your own kind of learning about what these monuments entail. And I don't know how useful they would be actually as reading assignments for students. You know, some might work better than others, I think, just depending on the level of difficulty. But in any case, I put together a whole kind of reading list and resources that instructors can use along with the different websites that have really great graphics and images related to the memorial. So I think, you know, if folks, Oh, the other thing I have been able to personally visit, the Washington Memorial, the Seoul War Memorial, and then the one in Pyongyang. But I myself have not been able to actually visit the one in China. And so I put it as an option, but I'm still on the fence about whether to put this in here because I haven't been able to visit it myself. It's largely drawn from one of the contributors who wrote about this in the special journal issue that I mentioned. But I'm leaving it as an option, but I feel like the 3 sites already can be pretty. I mean, there's a lot to deal with there. So I'll just say I'm on the fence about it, and maybe I'll take it out. I don't know yet, but maybe we can just devote the last 5 minutes to questions.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
And
I guess while we're
as we're
please go
waiting
ahead.
for questions, I will just because to gesture towards at the end of the guide, actually, Jason added some resources related to local memorials and projects within Connecticut that might be usefully be added. But I'll just say, it's always a surprise to me whenever I'm traveling anywhere to just like happen upon a Korean War memorial in these small towns. And so what's I think what could productively be added, I kind of included as an additional exercise, but students can kind of be encouraged to visit their local memorial and see what differences there might be in the way that it's memorialized locally as opposed to nationally, or to just compare these different narratives across different parts of both within the country but also abroad.
Yeah, that's a great it's a great recommendation. And I guess maybe I will share a bit here. Just to highlight the fact that, as you're saying, so this is the local resource handbook portion here, where I highlight the demographics of Korean Americans in Connecticut. Where do they live? And also there, some socioeconomic data here too to show that that they are quite diverse, economically as well. There's a couple stories about Korean Americans here in Connecticut. Jenny Hakila Diaz, who is our activist in residence with the Institute, um, and has done a story about her family, their family, and as well as a narrative from an interview with a Korean adoptee in the 1980s here from South Windsor. And just to highlight Suzy's point, these are a list of some of the local war memorials in Connecticut. And the last thing I wanted to mention was, growing up, my parents watched MASH, the TV show MASH, and the in some ways the war was a punchline to that show, and the background, but it was signaled by the helicopter coming and bringing in the wounded folks and wounded soldiers. And it happens that Connecticut built the helicopters for the Korean War. And so this page here really connects some of these stories and the history of the company Sikorsky here in Connecticut that builds those helicopters, and connects that to present day also militarization, which they continue to sell Black Hawk helicopters to South Korea. So so these are just a sampling of these resources to bring it home, to look at multiple perspectives, and to really attend to the attend to voices of people who've experienced this conflict, and the long resonance that it has long afterwards. I'm I'm just struck by the humanity and the tremendous ways that we need to attend to so many different dimensions of this. So I'm seeing a question here. Talk a little bit more about misconceptions about North Korean people outside of their country, that the people are different from the government. Right, and that's from Helmer Mara.
I'm not entirely sure what you're at, like that. I think there is a little bit unpacking to do, that people are different from the government.
Mhm.
Could you, Helmer, do you mind asking the question a little more? Like, do you mind telling us where you're coming from? And I think, Suzy, you might be a better person to actually talk about it.
Maybe this was in reference to something you had mentioned. I'm not quite sure, but I suppose, I mean, there is, I'll just riff, assuming I understand correctly what the question is about. I mean, the vast majority of, mainstream media portrayals of North Korea basically can be categorized into two, kind of almost diametrically opposed images, right? So on the one hand, it's like the military marching like lockstep, like just threatening power, like soldiers that are just ready to like pounce, on the United States. And then there's the completely opposite kind of image of like the starving children and, people like destitute and not able to have enough food and very like weak, oppressed, by their state. So, I mean, these are very diametrically opposed, almost stereotypes, like stereotype images, caricatures, essentially, that highlight only one particular aspect of North Korea. And so I think not only is there a need to have a more complicated understanding, just as anywhere, like if you were to walk down, I mean, just because New York is so close to where I am, but if you were to just walk down New York, on the one hand, you see one of the most opulent cities in the world, but then you also see, the unhoused, like people that are homeless just in the streets. And so the kind of stark disparities in that sense that are there right where we are. I don't know how things are in Brazil, where I know Helmer, the question is being asked from, but there are these kind of very disparate images no matter where you are. And I think it's important to think about how those caricatured images don't necessarily represent kind of the average experiences of people that are there. And so there's a need to kind of understand that there's a diversity and a complexity of experiences for North Korean people inside their country. And then the other thing is, there's a tendency to basically see North Korea as, I mean, the Bush's Axis of Evil speech from 2002, I think it was, essentially North Korea has been the axis of evil ever since that speech. And that again also is another way to paint North Korea in a particular caricature. It's just one aspect. Yes, I mean, North Korea has tons of problems. So do we. And it's not, to associate basically the state with the people, is a simplistic way of looking at North Korea as basically a homogenized kind of, the epitome of evil. And I think that doesn't really serve, neither does it serve the people in North Korea, and it certainly doesn't serve us, where, if you just paint them as evil, then they're never going to be partners for negotiation or any kind of normalized relations, which is ultimately what's going to be needed to end the Korean War.
I'm just gonna add one more thing really briefly. Okay, I think Helmer had a follow-up. Influence of Hallyu in China. Yeah. I'm not, and yeah, I think what you were saying is true. I'm not entirely sure if I fully understand your question, but I just wanted to add to what Suzy was saying. Again, there has been a lot of different caricatured or stereotypical notions of North Korea, and it was very easily like collapsed into the regime. But recently, and by recent, I'm like saying probably in the past decade, there has been a lot of political and cultural efforts to separate North Korean people from the state. And I would actually say, along with a lot of other scholars, that this is not necessarily, and that was what activated or made possible for countries like United States being the first country that accepted North Koreans as refugees, and Canada as the second one, but also the first country in the world to actually accept North Koreans as through private sponsorship. And what that separation of the people from the regime allowed for is for these people to be able to critique the regime as like North Koreans are unlike the regime. When they're in North Korea, they are like the regime, brainwashed, but once they leave, they can be like us. They can have critical thoughts. They can critique the regime. They can actually talk and think critically of their previous experiences and become these beacons of people who are fighting for, humanity and human rights. So that is, I'm echoing Suzy's point that we need to diversify how we think about North Koreans outside of that kind of boxes. But also what I'm saying is that the way in which that kind of differentiation of the people from the regime is happening also has a very particular political valence in order to accept the refugees and also to condemn the regime, utilizing the refugees as the figures who are the proof of the critique of the regime. So it's happening at a very particular political juncture when US was also turning full on for that excess of evil speech and for that kind of like war on terror movement. So I don't think it's an innocuous movement to really, it's not necessarily a movement to embrace the people, but it also is a very different kind of strand of stereotype that is fueled by largely political agenda as well. So I'm just gonna end there.
Yeah, thank you. And like many of the other topics we discussed, has multiple perspectives and is a constantly evolving and changing, situation. So we have another question, and I think this ought to be our last one, and then we can wrap up, and then I will be thanking you all. And so this one is for any professor, anyone here that says, believe that African American history isn't taught in schools in order to not acknowledge the significance and severity of that said history. Do you agree that Korean War isn't taught for the same reasons as African American history?
I think
Appreciate
it's
the
actually
question
worth.
to think through different silences, but I
No,
want
I didn't want to
to
be dominating the space. I was just waiting to see if anybody would like to go. But I think it actually bears reminding, I mean, I do highlight this when I talk about the Korean War, but one of the at least for the United States, one of the more significant aspects of the Korean War is that it was the first time that the United States fought, with an integrated armed forces due to presidential, I think, directives issued. I forget the exact number of the resolution, but in any case, and what's actually really significant to also note, I think, in recent historiography on the Korean War was to basically highlight the fact that, African American soldiers, despite the integrated armed forces, were the ones. If you look at the rates of court martials, for example, for either, for abandoning, what is it, when they go AWOL or something like that, African American soldiers were court-martialed at a much higher rate than, your average white soldier. So despite the attempt to kind of integrate the armed forces, I think, there was no going around the fact that racism was rampant within the military. And it's not a coincidence then that African American soldiers were the soldiers that, I mean, as few as they were, some of them were the ones that ended up choosing not to actually, if they were POWs, for example, they chose not to return to the United States. And some of the kind of the so-called education of the POWs that were performed by North Korea and the Chinese on the US soldiers, oftentimes were trying to actually hammer home this point that, with Jim Crow and the kind of racism and discrimination against African Americans in the United States, what are you doing fighting for the United States, essentially? And clearly some of that argument held sway. So I think you're absolutely right. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. I'm so sorry, but you make a really great point that I think for these same reasons, some of these histories are not emphasized because it would mean that the United States would actually have to confront, these histories of discrimination and racism and genocide.
That was very well stated. And I'll just make another plug for one of the resources I added that connects the Puerto Rican regiment that was sent to fight in the Korean Peninsula. They're called the Boricuaniers, and many of them reside in Connecticut. And so, again, another instance of these connections. So, it is a couple minutes after our end time. So I am so deeply appreciative of you giving us your evening and sharing your wisdom and your experience with this, because this is a topic that we deeply need and that we will continue to come back to. So thank you for the attendees for coming, and we'll be sharing out the resource and the teaching guide, and really look forward to long-term engagement and developing these lessons to be in Connecticut classrooms
And elsewhere.
and elsewhere. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
much.
much. Thanks for coming.
Awesome.
I learned a lot.
Me too. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Good night,
Bye.
everyone.